In the name of the one and only, we are presenting the next session of the Indigo Firmament, perhaps the concluding session on the perception of Islam. In here, I want to address two issues. One, what was the reason for the rise of Islam earlier, and how we have fallen off the track eventually in the last few centuries. One of the main contributions of the Muslim civilization was that of raising the level of knowledge, of science, and of learning, and of intellectualism, making it universal, taking out of the domain of a class distinction or of a professionalism and expanding it to the level of populism. And by populism, I mean not in the strictly political context, but rather to make it popular, to popularize education, with the saying of the Prophet that learn even if it takes you to China. And there, China was perhaps the farthest place in terms of what they knew at the time, in terms of the geographic expanse of the earth. But the idea was that you have to go to the end of the world. Even if it takes you to the end of the world, go, but learn. Generally, in the context of knowledge, language is important. The world community, or at least that part of it with which I have some familiarity, we have some key languages that are considered scientific languages. Chinese is one of those, Sanskrit is another, Latin, and then of course Arabic. So every language in the world is not necessarily a scientific language by this definition. English is becoming one now, but we are talking about an early period in history. The advantage that Arabic got over those other three, Latin, Chinese, and Sanskrit, was that the universality of the cultural setting in which Arabic was operating. So in the early part of the Islamic history, everything scientific was written in the Arabic language. Eventually other languages evolved, but still you could write poetry in Persian, but if you had to present a treatise in some scientific field, it had to be in Arabic. We see this, for instance, in the works of Abu Rayhan al-Biruni and Ibn Sina or Avicenna. For instance, their scientific work in medicine and in geography and all that, they are all written in Arabic. But their poetry and other work could be written in other languages. That was just an example. So, what happened in that as the domain of the Muslim states and the Muslim caliphates and rulerships expanded to a level which was impossible to be maintained and retained and restrained politically, there arose a need for creating a kind of a secondary vehicle for the transfer of thought, and by thought I mean scientific thought. So in my estimation, 4 languages were created, and by created I don't mean they were created from scratch, ex nihilo. Rather, they evolved through the intermingling and intermixture of different linguistic domains. One of those that is by necessity called Persian today is a language that rose from kind of the ashes, or rather from the realm of the region that today would be defined roughly Central Asia, containing Afghanistan and modern-day Iran. And perhaps it was accidental. But it's also important that with the expansion of Islam as a religion and the Arab influence of the Arab states under the Umayyads, 2 languages virtually collapsed in the region. One was Pahlavi, which was the language of the Sasani dynasty in modern-day southwest Iran. The other was Surdi, which was spoken in perhaps northern Afghanistan and parts of today's Tajikistan. The collapse of these 2 languages allowed for Arabic to spread faster, to replace, to fill the gap, so to say. What happened subsequently is that when those languages collapsed, Arabic became the language of the state. And so when local people had to do any business with the state, it had to be through Arabic language. But people soon realized that not only was Arabic language foreign in that context. Now, matters of religion and faith and reading the Quran and the prayers, that's a different thing. But operating through the state apparatus, through the state machine in the Arabic language, for the average person on the street, that was a different matter. There is a legend that's probably close to historical evidence, and I have seen it in the works of Ghabar, Mir Ghulam Muhammad Ghabar, whose work Afghanistan dar Masir Tarikh, or Afghanistan in the course of history, he refers to an incident. I hope that is the right source I'm quoting. I might have read it elsewhere. That with the first revolt against the, if you can use a modern term, the Empire Strikes Back, kind of before the Empire Strikes Back, there was a resistance to the empire, to the Abbasids in Baghdad, that a suzerainty or a small state was created in Pushang or Foshanj in near Herat in modern-day Afghanistan by a dynasty of the Tahirids, and they were basically rejecting the authority of Baghdad and were establishing their own state and appointing their own governors And one such governor who was appointed, I believe, in Mar, who was later writing back to the court of the Tahirids, wrote a letter, and since he was not fully literate in the Arabic language, which would have been the law and the norm for any government correspondence, he used his local language dialect and simply filled it with the Arabic terminologies and vocabulary that were expected of him. And when the letter reached the court of the Tahirids and they read it, they found it very amusing, entertaining, interesting, and funny. But then they realized that no matter how it was written, it did make sense. And so, because this, by sense I mean that the governor was able to communicate and to get his point across for the purpose for which he had written the letter. And so they realized that because it made sense, even though the vocabulary was predominantly Arabic, but the substructure was that of Aryanic languages, primarily the Ashkani dialect that they probably spoke in the region, that they give that a notoriety, and this notoriety resulted in the Tahirids accepting this language as the court language, and eventually the Arabs by necessity called it Persian. It certainly did have the structure of the Persian language, but it wasn't the Persian that people knew at the time. And let me take a slight detour here, that in the historical context we know the ancient Persian called Furs Qadim. We also know the Middle Persian, which would primarily be the Pahlavi and the Ashkani dialects, and many regional, of course. And then what we call modern Persian is the language we are talking about here. That this language that came into existence by accident, design, or political necessity of the time was called Persian by the Arabs. And linguistically speaking, that will be the modern Persian, which in its initial form was probably 90% Arabic, with 10% Persian structure. In a more recent study, I think back in 1960s, it was estimated that at least the Persian or Dari language, the way it's spoken in Afghanistan, still contained 86% Arabic vocabulary. However, in recent times, those numbers have changed, and that's a different discussion we can get into. But the point is that a language was created as a vehicle and as a medium. And again, the Tahirids were not rejecting Islam as a religion. They were rejecting the authority of Baghdad as a political power. So they were making themselves politically independent, but religiously connected and related. So gradually that language was that they adopted as their court language, their state language was adopted later by the Safarids and the Samanids north in Balkh in modern-day Afghanistan again, and then eventually by the Ghaznavids in Ghazni in southern Afghanistan. So then we can say in general that modern Afghanistan would be the birthplace of this language. That was basically considered an extended vehicle for the expansion of Islam into farther regions in Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. There was another language that came into existence in the Iberian Peninsula, which was called Alhamiado. And Alhamiado was a mixture of Spanish and Arabic at the time. And again, Alhamiado became another vehicle in the expansion of Islam there. We talked in the earlier session about the formation of the Swahili or Swahili language on the African continent, which became the third language that was again heavily loaded with Arabic, but used the Bantu language structure and allowed for further expansion of Islam into the coastal regions of Africa, the eastern coast. Then subsequently, I think in the 14th and 15th century, the court language of India, which at that time was, at least in the Muslim courts, was Hindawi, was replaced by what eventually became known as the Urdu language under the Mughals, which again became another subset or extended language. Therefore, to go back to our earlier analogy of having scientific languages in the world, we had Chinese, Sanskrit, Latin, and Arabic. The first three did not have this extension. Arabic, in essence, was a scientific language at two levels. One, at the level of language Arabic language by itself, and second, in this second tier of kind of having given birth to languages that were, as I said earlier, with the precaution of artificiality, that these artificial languages, rather the languages that were admixture of two languages that straddled the boundaries of language and culture, that included the structure of one and the vocabulary of the other, artificial only in this sense. I do not mean, by the word artificial, I do not mean as something that is just a made-up language, but that everything existed there. They were kind of repackaged differently. So this was a major contribution that helped Islam being expanded to other cultures and to other regions of the world. There, at that time, Islam would have been a positive force. Then we come to, we are jumping here a couple of centuries, to the age of colonialism, and then the Islamic revivalism against colonialism, which will be then divided into three parts. There was a term of the Salafi or Salafist Islamic revivalism that we referred to earlier in our discussion of the Wahhabism. But in general, that the revivalism was of three types. There was a religious Islamism, which is a fundamentalist expression of how Islam has to be viewed and understood, primarily in the political arena. There is political Islamism, which is the Islamism or Islam as an ideology for the replacement of ruling regimes. And there is radical Islamism, which is establishing Islamic states throughout the region, or at least in some region, and often through violence. So this distinction is necessary to make, that religious Islamism, political Islamism, and radical Islamism are three different things, because often when we just throw the word Islam or Islamic, the person who expresses the word has one idea, the people who hear might not have the same idea. And the effect of that in the course of modern history, contemporary history, more recent history, has been one where so this has been more a reactionary attitude. And by reactionary, I mean a reaction to the Western colonialism, a reaction to the Western aggressions, reactions to Western policies and politics, reactions to Western political designs on the Muslim lands. In that sense, all of these three had been reactionary. And reactionary things are usually defensive. And therefore, the general setting for these reactionary thoughts has been one of a negativity of its perception. So the Muslim world was seen through that still as backward, regressive, and therefore negative. And that will be, in its strictly descriptive sense, justifiable and understandable. However, what happens in addition to that is that there is the sense of the neo-colonialism in which this negative image of Islam is made more visible, more prominent, deliberately by the opponents of the Muslims. And I'm not speaking about opponents in the religious context, because the rivalry, the Muslim-Christian rivalry in its latest phase, in its latest manifestation, is one of ideology and economics more than of religious belief system. In fact, in most cases, Muslim and Christians probably read from the same page. And by page, I don't mean scriptural page. I mean in terms of how they understand each other, in terms of a general monotheistic thought. So that is not a problem. The problem is where a political ideology intervenes for various economic and political interests. That's where the clash between the two occurs. And I'm going to delineate this, that the negativity, for which partly the reactionary attitude of the Muslims is responsible, but also because of the policies of the West, whose interests are involved in that, and therefore it creates a conflict of interest for them, is relevant here. So I'm going to go through roughly the 20th century, when the major Muslim empires collapsed and the West took over, especially after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. There was that turn of the century, the 20th century of the Common Era, was a period for a second wave of revivalism. The first wave we classified as the times of Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani and Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and Mehdi and Mukhtar. That was the first wave, where the charismatic personality of individuals was pivotal in the formation of those movements. In the second wave, it wasn't the individual, rather the collective. It wasn't the elderly, rather it was the young, it was the youth. So starting with the with the Young Turks, for example. Yes, they had leaders, but it was the collective of the Young Turks that gained prominence rather than the individual. Or we have the constitutional reform in Persia, 1905 or thereabouts, in which again, yes, there were leaders, but it was that collective concept of constitutionalism or saltanat or mashrutiyat rather, that became important. The same thing happened in Afghanistan within a decade, that it was this movement against the reactionary attitude of Amir Habibullah that spawned a movement. Yes, it was headed by a prince, but even then it was a young prince. Yes, it was a prince, but he was not alone. And so people of all walks of life, especially the youth, the young, they were involved in this. And we also had back in the 1920s then the Muslim Brotherhood that came into existence in Egypt, Rashid Reza and several others in Syria and other places of the Arab world, of the Muslim world. And most of these, it was the movement now. This is the second wave of these reforms. Whether they amounted to much or not, that's a different question. We're not going to make an assessment of their success. Rather, we are going to identify them as to the phases of these revolutions or evolutions, and to see what the process was. And as far as the perception of Islam goes during this period, the majority would have been positive from the Muslim lands, aspirational, hopeful, and kind of waiting for that opportune moment to spark. And World War I, or the European War I, may have provided such an opportunity. But it also entailed a lot of failures and disappointments. So the earlier period was a period of imperialism versus nationalism. That will be 1914 to 1948 of the Common Era, where the defining ideology or the thrust of any intellectual thought had been such where Muslim people thought that the only way they can express themselves is to free themselves of the burden of their own imperial states that were too huge to be functional. And this applies more so to the domains of the Ottomans, where nation states were created and carved out of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore a kind of nationalism spawned. It may also have been spurred by nationalism in Europe, where the wars that were fought were primarily fought by those who define themselves in a nationalistic sense. For instance, Germany as a nation state was seen much more powerful than the Habsburgs or the Austro-Hungarian empire that was on the decline. The nation of Russia, spearheading a communist revolution, was much more important than the imperial Tsarist Russia, and so on. So this was again in a way a European thought that came through this modernization setting. So Muslims tried to define themselves as nations. And so this continued until 1948, and yes, some nations did come into existence. We do understand the artificial boundaries that were created by colonial powers. Nonetheless, a country that we call Syria today was in a way set up back circa World War I rather. The other states around the Arab world would be pretty much in the same league. The second period that contributed to this negativity was that of the Zionism versus Arab nationalism. Now that Arab nationalism came into existence, it was no longer focused on its colonial suppressors, the French and the English, or the Italians, as much as it was the existence of Zionism. This would be the period between 1948 to 1967. The next period will be the secular nationalism versus Islamism, which was 1967 to 1970. And so in these various phases, either an ideology is created or the focus has shifted from one thing to another. While the average person on the street may have identified himself or herself more as a Muslim, but then this new national identity made out of those same Muslims an Iraqi. So, for instance, before the fall of the Ottoman, a person who lived in Mosul or in Baghdad, all they knew is that they were citizens of this great empire, the Ottoman state. And then the Ottomans disintegrate, and so the next day they are told, at least in Mosul in northern Iraq, that, oh yeah, they are part of a Kurdistan, a separate state. And as soon as the British discover that there is oil in Kirkuk, and that creating a separate state in the north will make it difficult for the British to take that oil from a landlocked country through another country, which was Iraq to the south, then they virtually erased the border between Iraq and Kurdistan early on, and put the two together and created a greater Iraq, what we know today. So then, again, in the course of time, those same people who once called themselves Ottomans, the next day they called themselves Kurd, subsequently called themselves Iraqis. So all these identities were and are artificial, because a few miles away there would have been other Kurds who called themselves Syrians, and there would have been other Arabs who would have called themselves either Iraqis or Saudis, and so on. So in this vast region, in the desert of northern part of Arabia, or close to the Fertile Crescent, the boundaries were totally artificial. But eventually, we saw, for instance, during the Gulf War, that many of these states sent their armies to fight, like Syria sent their troops or others to fight Iraqis, as if these were totally different nations and different people. The next part that would be that we would like to discuss is the strategic co-optation and radicalization, which is the 1971 to 1981 period. And here, let me bridge that which happened in World War I with, or the European War, with that which happened subsequently. That in 1948, the formation of the State of Israel, which, of course, we all know the history of it, and that's not our focus. Our focus is that how it defined the identities of the people in the states around it. That, like I said, that the focal point was Zionism, and the reason for that was that the Arabs soon realized that their fervor for nationalism may have been positive in certain ways, but it certainly had more negativity in the sense that these new boundaries were dividing them, and they had the potential of disuniting them. And so the movement began for bringing them all back together. And the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1929 was such an attempt that by virtue of the fact that it was called Muslim Brotherhood, it did not tie it down to any one of these particular quote-unquote nation states that were artificially created by colonial powers. So the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood would have been just as its predecessor of Pan-Islamism implied, was to apply it across the boundaries and to make it more universal. And by universal I mean within the context of the Ummah, a universal concept of unifying or strengthening and reuniting in order to fight the European colonial powers. And so the ideology that then came was that, yes, okay, we have been identified as separate nation states, but they should not confine us. They should not divide us. So that first attempt was the Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt, but there were similar movements elsewhere that also made attempts to uniting. And the other one was the Pan-Turanism, which was an attempt to unite all the Turkic nations and tribes and states together across Central Asia along with Turkey. And there again, a pattern that we have seen repeatedly in modern history is that anytime there had been an attempt to unite, those attempts had been shunned. Those attempts had been marginalized, and those attempts have eventually left the political scene. So during the time or the fall of or the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, we had the Pan-Turanian movement that was led by Anwar Pasha and Jamal Pasha and several other of their leaders, whose idea was that yes, the Ottomans may have disintegrated, the Ottoman Empire is no longer, and yes, the Arabs are fighting and want to be a separate nation, but why don't we capitalize on the situation and bring into the fold the Azeris and the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz and the other Turkic tribes of Central Asia, the Tatars, and that way we can form a linguistically or ethnically identifiable, more coherent and integrated state. In opposition to this movement was Mustafa Kemal, who wanted to get rid of everyone and create a small state, which he, by design, wanted to be all Turkish, regardless of the Kurds in the eastern part of the country. But in other words, Ataturk wanted the smaller state, and the Pan-Turanian movement wanted the larger state. And of course, the West eventually supported Ataturk to create a much smaller state, which fits perfectly with the concept of divide and conquer. The subsequent movements that happened in the Muslim world for similar reunification or reintegration, they all faced the same thing. People who are in the forefront, and like I said, the Muslim Brotherhood that is vilified to this day, one of the major reasons for its vilification is its philosophy of reuniting. And this would be at the mass level, at the people's level, at the popular level, not at the state level. We had other attempts by states, such as the formation of the United Arab Republics, that was initiated by Jamal Nasser in Egypt, with Syria and Yemen and Iraq at some point, and then again attempts were made to make that a failure rather than a success. We also had the attempt, I think, by Muammar Gaddafi of uniting Sudan, Egypt, and Libya together, which also failed. And so as we can see that the great villains were then those who were unifying the Muslim lands. Gaddafi, the most perhaps hated and vilified leader of more recent times, and Nasser was certainly not liked in the West in spite of his great charisma and all that. And of course Anwar Pasha and Jamal Pasha those were just two of the leaders of the Pan-Turanian movements. So here is this at the underlying level, below the surface, the hands that play, in essence, all the attempts for reunification or unification of the Muslim lands are thwarted because of the opponents at the ideological level. So we move on to the formation of the State of Zionism, which was very instrumental in this, not just because of the location of the State of Israel right at the heart of the Muslim lands all around it, but that the State of Israel, in addition to becoming the homeland for the Jews, which is one issue, it also became an outpost, an imperial outpost for the West, which is a different function, a different role that Israel is playing. And so, therefore, for the Muslim lands, that became a very, very critical issue. And so all of these led to a point where the resistance of the Muslim masses against such Western intrusions got into a different phase. And this different phase was, in a way, had the opportunity to have an outside endorsement. And this endorsement came, of course, from the side of the Soviet Union, because after World War I, or the European War I, the formation of a communist state, or communist/socialist state, or state capitalist state in the Soviet Union appeared to be a greater threat to Western capitalism. So for Western Europeans who always saw themselves in some kind of a rivalry with the Muslim East, all of a sudden realized that no, it's not the Muslims. The Muslims have been scattered and disintegrated enough that they do not pose a threat to the West anymore. The new threat was one of communism. And the roughly 70 years of the rise, during the rise and fall of communism from 1917 to 1989, this is a period where the Muslim lands, for at least for a time, could breathe easily. Why? Because the West was not really focused on them directly. And the Muslim lands in particular and the Third World in general were not simply at the mercy of the West. There was first the Soviet Union and later on Communist China that from time to time came to their support and formed alliances with them. And in spite of the containment policies of the West that created military alliances like NATO and SEATO and CENTO and ANZUS and so on to contain communism, the communists were in a way, or communist Soviet Union was in a way an alternative, at least at the international arena, at the United Nations, and that the third world countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in a way kind of looked up to, or at least had some hope. But at the same time then, the struggles of many of these states, especially that of the Palestinians, for instance, kind of took a different turn. That immediately after World War II, or the European War II, the concept of religion had become irrelevant. Rather, this nationalistic identity was important, along with an ideological affiliation. Of course, since the rise of the Soviet Union, religion was, marginalized, shelved, at least for a time. And so that's why the subsequent movements that came had to have anything identify them but religion. So we had a movement of the Arab socialism, whose founding fathers included many non-Muslims, including Michel Aflaq of Syria and Tariq of Iraq, and of course we had Habash of Palestine and so on and so forth, who are very prominent, at least in the Arab world, that were not Muslims. So Arab socialism in a way took the thunder of Islamic Brotherhood, again, ideology taking over religion. And so Nasser and the coup with General Najib in Egypt, 1952, and then of course the rise of Mossadegh in Iran, and so this give a momentum of an ideological, practical, economical concepts rather than a religious identity. And so it's during this Arab nationalism that, again, a lot of these countries are making attempts to unify, but that doesn't work. But the eventual outcome is that the alliances that were formed based on who was in whose party, pact, or side are prevalent to this day. In the current crisis, the support of Moscow for the regime in Damascus is nothing new for which we can give credit to Putin, but rather that Syria was an ally of the former Soviet Union, and a staunch ally, because it was across the border from Israel, that is an ally of the West. So again, in some way, it's these foreign battles that are being fought on Muslim lands or in the general region. And so in this case, we had Iraq, who at one point was on the side of the United States. After 1958, the coup by Karim Qasim, it fell to the side, it went over to the side of the Soviet Union. We had Egypt, that was at one point on the side of the West under King Farouk. In 1952, it went over to the side of the Soviet Union with Jamal Nasser and General Najib. And then subsequently, with the rise to power of Anwar Sadat, it is switched back to the West. So most of these alliances are then fought, or actual alliances are formed by ideologies, and the ideologies are not Muslim ideologies, and I'm not defining them in religious context, but rather in the political setting of the world. And so because the ideologies come from abroad, the resistance to them has to be against these foreign ideologies, whether it's resistance against communism in places like Afghanistan, resistance against capitalism in the literal sense or in the ideological sense. So still the battles in the Muslim lands are fought against foreign ideologies. And so the reaction from the West, and this is deliberate, is to vilify these movements. And I'm not questioning whether they deserve it or not, that's a different matter, but the attempt is to vilify movements, any mass movements that's either unifying or that is identifying with a more universal Islamic concept, rather that they should be kept within the confines of these various states. And the end result is that where we are now, that these, in the absence of the Soviet Union, which allowed a bipolar world, now with the dominance of the United States, we are at a point where the United States, as the dominant superpower of the world, has felt it either necessary or practicable to intervene without fearing the Soviet Union. So it's after the fall of the Soviet Union that the United States has so bluntly invaded many of these Muslim countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and so on and so forth, many of them directly and many of them through proxies. This would have been inconceivable during the time of the Soviets, because they would have challenged it, and the United States would have known and seen that as a deterrence. So one of the reasons that the Muslim lands are easily invaded, whether it's the all-out attack from Italians and French and Americans and every other European countries to change regime in Libya, for example, or the attacks that are happening against the people in Yemen, with the collaboration of the Saudis by Americans, or we can switch the roles, that it's the Saudi attack with the approval of the United States, playing the role of a proxy. So most of these wars that are happening today, in a way, are happening because the Muslim world does not have any other power that comes to their support, and they themselves have become very, very weak. And in this sense, then, that East-West rivalry, that Muslim-Christian rivalry at some level, has come back to play its role, and therefore the vilification of the Muslims in general and the vilification of their resistant movements that have been radicalized because of circumstance, movements such as the Taliban, such as ISIS, and so on. And that even this radicalization is the result of political frustration. Now, I'm certainly not justifying what they do. I'm simply describing why have they become so radicalized. Very simple. if there had been a medium, if there had been an avenue for them to express their desires through a legitimate government for a change, political, social change in their own countries, they would not have been radicalized. And they have been radicalized in most cases where regimes are supported by the West, where regimes have been delegitimized. So these radical movements in these countries know the hand behind the scene as much as they see the puppet on the stage. So their anger is directed both towards puppets, for lack of a better term, and these puppet regimes, but it's also this anger is directed towards those who support these puppet regimes. And knowing how strong the West is and feeling so frustrated in their inability to do anything about it, the psychological effect, obviously, in this frustration is radicalization and marginalization and fanaticization, if I can coin a word here. And so this helps the West by vilifying them and therefore justifying their interventions. And like I said, we started with Islamic civilization, the glorious past, in which the perception of Islam was very, very positive, and we have reached a point where the mere utterance of the word Islam or Muslim is automatically equated with violence and terrorism. And these terms have become more or less synonymous because of the power politics that are prevalent in the world today. And this concludes our discussion of the perception of Islam through the course of history, from being one of a very positive to a very, very negative. And that is a struggle, it's a mission, it's a sense of social and political responsibility for Muslims in general and for everyone else to fight against, so we can live in a more peaceful world, in a more brotherly and sisterly equality among peoples of all faiths in a communion, in a universal communion. I bid you farewell for today until our next program of the Indigo Firmament. Have a nice day.